and welcome to our Web Accessibility 101 webinar. My name is Ella, and today I'm going to be talking you through accessibility, what it is, why it's important, and give you a rundown on everything you need to know to get started. Now, if you're not familiar with accessibility, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to be covering everything from the basics, so you won't need any prior knowledge. So let's take a look at what we're actually going to be covering today. So I'll start off with a quick introduction about myself, and then we'll move on to what web accessibility actually is, why should you care about it, and I'll give some examples on how disabled people use the web so that we're a little bit more familiar with how it works in practice. We'll also spend some time looking at common accessibility problems. So I'll talk about issues that I tend to see the most frequently in websites when I do my accessibility audits. And then we'll dive a little bit into how we can actually resolve and fix those issues. Then we'll look at WCAG, which is the international standard that we use to, sort of measure how accessible a website is. And then finally, we'll wrap up with how you can contribute and what you can do in your role as of right now. So that's the agenda for today. Lots of things planned, lots of things to get on with. So yeah, let's get started. Now, before we dive into accessibility, I thought it would be quite nice just to give you a quick little intro about myself, just who I am, what I do, and how I got into accessibility in the first place. So I'm Ella. I'm a web accessibility specialist and a front-end developer at Catalyst. So I juggle both roles on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes, depending on the week, I do more front-end work. Sometimes I do more accessibility work. But the great thing is that they do tie in quite nicely to each other. So I initially started off with front-end, but I think it was sometime during my first year as a dev, I attended an accessibility forum for the first time. And this forum was very, it was like an intro to the basics. So pretty much what this webinar is, but it was very much an eye-opening experience. I remember that, that little intro presentation gave me this new perspective to the web that I'd never thought about, I'd never considered before, and thinking back on it now, that's made me realize that accessibility is one of those things where people aren't really conscious of it or properly consider it until they receive some kind of exposure to it. Because up until then, all I really cared about was things like, is my website functional? Is my website pretty? Does it look like the designs? And obviously, that's all a really big part of my front-end role, but I was never really aware of the accessibility side because I never got that introduction or exposure to the topic. And it wasn't until I started learning all of these things about, what makes something accessible versus what doesn't, that just really made me think, oh yeah, like that makes total sense. Why aren't we making things accessible in the first place? And then I was fortunate enough to be offered the accessibility specialist role, and yeah, that was it. So I went through months of training and online courses to get up to speed. And so today I'm going to try my best to package all of that up into this webinar and give you everything you need to know to get started. I also used to be someone who thought accessibility was this really big and broad, scary topic, and it definitely can seem like that at first, but we'll try to break it down into hopefully what should be something easy and intuitive to understand. So, what actually is web accessibility? By definition, web accessibility is the inclusive practice of ensuring that everyone can access and interact with the same content, regardless of disability. So in other words, making sure that the products that we create can be used by everybody. And now some of you may be thinking, okay, like that's great, I get that, but it doesn't really affect me, so why should I care? And unfortunately, a lot of people have this misconception that web accessibility only caters to disabled users, and that's just not true. While, yes, a big focus of accessibility is to make sure that people with disabilities are able to use websites and applications, accessibility is really meant to benefit everybody, whether or not you have a disability. So it might not affect you right now where you currently are, but it might affect someone you know, like your family member or a friend, or it might even affect you later in life when you're getting older. According to the World Health Organization, it's estimated that there are 1.3 billion people worldwide with a significant disability, which roughly translates to 1 in 6 people. And if we actually narrow that down to New Zealand alone, we have at least 1.1 million disabled people, which is almost 24% of our population. So imagine having a website that wasn't accessible. That's almost 1 in 4 users who won't be able to access your content. And to add on to that, WebAIM has actually reported that they analyzed 1 million homepages, and from that, they identified 56 million accessibility issues. Now, keep in mind, these are only home pages. So this is one page out of who knows how much on a website. But that one page leading to 56 million accessibility issues is insane. And I get it. It can be hard to argue for an accessibility business case because, unfortunately, accessibility is one of those things where it's not something that immediately jumps out at you. It's not something that's super obvious or something that most people can identify straight away. But what I can tell you is that when you incorporate accessibility into your product, you are doing all of these things. You are extending your market reach. Just a quick little fun fact that the global spending power of disabled people is over $6 trillion. So think about how big your reach could be and all of the people that you're not reaching right now. It enhances your brand. So you'll be seen as a business that makes an effort to be inclusive, which is always a plus. I know there have been some really big lawsuits against popular food chains like Burger King and Domino's because disabled people couldn't use their website or their app to order food, and so they sued the companies. Which leads me to the next point, minimizing legal risk. Certain places do have laws that you'll need to comply with, so it's important to know what those laws are and which of those apply to you. Otherwise, you might have to face legal action and be sued for potentially who knows how much. So, whether it's from a personal or an ethical or even a business standpoint, the fact is that there is something to gain for everyone involved. So before I talk about how we can actually solve these accessibility problems, I always like to start off with the why. Why do we have to do all of these things that we do? And one of the most important things that I learned as I was doing my training was that even though knowing WCAG is important and knowing all the rules and solutions is really helpful, I feel like there's more value in actually understanding what it is that people struggle with. Because even if you don't remember the specifics, like, oh, we need to do this page a certain way, or this element needs this attribute, blah, 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 if you can understand why someone might struggle with something and understand what it would be like for them if you were in their shoes, then you can piece together what it is that you need to do to address that. So let's look at the different types of disabilities first. Usually when people hear the word disability, they tend to think of physical disabilities. So someone in a wheelchair, for example, that's the most common logo that we see for disabilities. But as you can see, we've got a whole range of different types: visual, auditory, speech, motor, and cognitive. So let's look at visual disabilities first. This can include people who have poor vision, who might be colorblind or fully blind. Now, it's important to know that it's not always going to be the same for everybody because disability is a spectrum, so it might vary from person to person. And what these users struggle with the most, again, it depends. Someone who can see but has poor vision, they might struggle with reading small text on a screen. So they're going to need some way or form to enlarge the content on a page. Now, usually zooming in on the browser is sufficient, but others might use special software like screen magnification tools, which is basically a tool that zooms in on the entire screen, and it can provide a bigger cursor or a custom crosshair for easier visibility. On the other hand, someone who is colorblind but has clear vision, they might be able to read small text perfectly fine, but they won't be able to see it if there isn't enough contrast between the text and the background. So if you had yellow text on white background, they might struggle with making out what that text says, so color contrast is a really important one for these users especially. For fully blind users, they might not be able to see anything at all, so they'll probably require some type of assistive technology like a screen reader. And a screen reader is a tool that many visually disabled people use to navigate through a page without needing to see it. So a blind user might use a keyboard to tab through a page, and every time they tab, a screen reader basically reads out all of the text and information that that element is communicating. So, for example, let's say you had a button. A blind user might come across this button, and the screen reader will say, this is a button, and this is the text on it. So this just means people don't need to see a website to be able to use it. Obviously, this is great, and we've got this really amazing technology to assist blind users, but what they end up struggling with is when websites don't have correctly written HTML, because that's what screen readers depend on to relay that information to users. So if your button was not using the button element and it was just using, a span, which is just plain text, or even a link, then the screen readers might read it differently, or it might not pick up on the button at all. So it is very important to make sure that your HTML is marked up correctly in order for these users to benefit from accessibility. Now, moving on to auditory disabilities, this can include people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Again, disability is a spectrum, so it's not going to be the same from person to person. But what these users struggle with is when information is communicated through sound. So, obvious examples, videos or audio. So if you had a video on your website that had verbal content or verbal instructions, or maybe you had, a podcast of people talking about something, then this will probably not be accessible to many deaf users. So they're going to need an alternative to sound, like a text transcript or captions. Basically, if you're using sound to communicate information, and that's the only way that you're communicating that information, then it's not going to be accessible for these users. You're going to need some type of visual message so that they don't have to rely on hearing to get access to the information. So that's just the main thing to be aware of if you have audio as part of your content. Speech disabilities. Now, this one doesn't actually tend to raise as many issues in web accessibility, or for websites at least, because you don't often see a lot of things that can be activated only by voice. But someone with a speech disability could be someone with a stutter or a lisp, or maybe it's someone who experiences pain or discomfort when they use their voice. Now, what these users struggle with, obviously, is when they have to use any voice-activated or speech recognition software. So the important thing here to consider is quite similar to auditory disabilities. is to provide an alternative input method. So for example, a text input where the user can type with their keyboard, or clickable elements on the screen that the user can interact with. Basically, you'd want to make sure that your users can access what they need without relying on their voice only. So that's the main thing to think about for these users. Motor disabilities. So this refers to physical disabilities, which includes people who may have trouble using a mouse or a trackpad. So someone with tremors, for example, they might find it difficult to accurately click on small objects on a screen. Someone with paralysis might not be able to move a mouse at all. So these users, typically they require either a keyboard or some type of special assistive technology. One example of this is the sip and puff. So the sip and puff is used by people who have very limited or no upper body movement. And it's basically a straw that the user can sip and puff into. And this basically mimics tabbing and clicking on a page, which is really cool. And another example is the camera switch. So there's a special type of camera in front of the person, and they tilt their head left and right. And this basically acts as a point and scan for the website. And I believe this is actually built into mobile phones for accessibility. So that's something you could try out yourself if you want to. But the important here to consider is the HTML. Make sure that it is marked up correctly, because all of these technologies rely on the markup. Otherwise, it's just not going to be a very pleasant experience for the user. And by now, you probably have noticed that there is a bit of an overlap between these different users and the kind of things that you need to do to make something accessible. And that just goes to show that anything you do can make a positive impact on a lot of people. It's not just exclusive to the group that you're targeting, it can be a plus for another group of people as well. And then last but not least, cognitive. And this one is probably the trickiest to tackle, just because there can be so much variation between each person. So cognitive disabilities usually affect how a person can understand information. So these users might struggle with a variety of issues. For example, understanding complex page layouts or complex text, or they might even find it difficult to keep their attention on a page. So usually what you'd want to focus on here is making sure things are presented as simply as possible. So this could mean structuring the page in a way that's easy to follow, or this could mean cutting out unnecessary animations or flickering objects, or even just using simple language, because there may be users that don't understand complex text, so they might not understand metaphors or nuance. But if you use simple language, at least they can still understand what is being communicated. So it's quite a broad range of what these users struggle with, but the key idea is to present things in a way that is easy to navigate, easy to understand, so that your users don't have a mental scramble trying to figure out what's happening. So that's the general gist of the different types of disabilities and the main struggles that these users might experience. But we can actually categorize this even further. And this part here is probably what's helped me the most to understand how accessibility benefits everybody. So we've got these 3 additional categories of disabilities: permanent, temporary, and situational. What we've just discussed, all of those are usually examples of permanent disabilities. So things that people struggle with for an extended period of time, or even for their entire lives. Temporary disabilities, on the other hand, these are disabilities that a person will usually only have for a short period of time. So to kind of have a better understanding of what this means, let's consider an imaginary person called Lily. So Lily, she's active, she's healthy, she's out snorkeling, on holiday, having the time of her life, and after a couple of days, she notices that everything sounds really quiet and she's struggling to hear things. So she goes to the doctor to get it checked up and finds out she's got an ear infection. The doctor says, it will go away in a couple of weeks, so no stress. But for those couple of weeks, Lily has a really difficult time hearing things. She has to turn up the volume super loud whenever she watches something on her phone or on the TV. So this is where things like captions and transcripts can become super valuable. Lily doesn't have any permanent or life-threatening conditions. She's just unfortunately been hit with a temporary infection. But we can see that accessibility helps her all the same. With situational disabilities, this is where a person is limited in their ability to do something because of the environment or the context that they're in. So let's take Lily again, for example. She's just about to head back to her hotel and she's trying to book an Uber on her phone, but even on the highest brightness level, the sun is glaring on her screen and she just can't see what's on her phone. She can see that there's some kind of text on the screen, but it's so faint that she doesn't know what it says. So this is where something like strong color contrast would be really helpful so that she can more easily distinguish the text from the background. Now, I know these examples have been quite specific, but the main idea I wanted to express here is that you don't have to be someone with a permanent disability. You could be perfectly healthy and you'll still be able to benefit from accessibility. I read this really good quote that stuck with me to this day, and it was, "So when you realize the benefits of accessibility to you personally, to your society, to your organization, you realize that pursuing accessibility really is an act of enlightened self-interest." Now, I like to think of this quote as meaning that accessibility is really there to help you. Any one of us could become disabled at any time, so if moral reasons aren't enough to convince you, making things accessible is really making things easier for you. Alright, so now that we've got a pretty decent understanding of what accessibility is and who it helps and why it's important, we can now look at what kind of accessibility problems actually exist. And there are a lot, so unfortunately we won't be able to cover all of them, but we'll look at the most common ones, which are often the ones that you can address straight away. And don't worry if you don't have much coding or technical experience. I've picked out the most common ones that don't really require extensive knowledge, so you'll still be able to understand the general idea without having to understand the specifics. So one of the most common problems that I see on almost every website that I visit is color contrast. Now, as you can probably tell from the name, it's the contrast between two colors. So basically, how easily can you see the foreground object against the background? So the higher the contrast, the easier it is to read the text. Let's take a look at these examples. The one on the left is an example of weak color contrast. So as a normal user, it's already a bit of a struggle for us to see the green against the dark pink, whereas the example on the right is very clear and easy to read. So that's what good color contrast looks like, and this is what we always want to aim for. Now, for some of us, the example on the left is a little bit hard to read, but it's not impossible. We can still sort of see it with a bit of effort. But look at what happens for fully colorblind users. We can't even see the text anymore because the color contrast is so weak. Now, obviously, this is quite an extreme example. I don't think anyone's really going to be using these colors with each other, or at least I hope not, but this is just an exaggerated demonstration to show how poor color contrast can be a problem for everyone. And unfortunately, a lot of websites have poor color contrast, which can make the experience really difficult for colorblind users. But the good news is that the solution is easy. as in we literally have calculators online that you can use. The one I personally use is from WebAIM, and you literally just put two colors in and it calculates the color contrast ratio for you. Now, depending on what you're testing, the ratio that you'll need to meet will vary. I won't go into too much detail about that, but to summarize, there are two different ratios that you will need to meet, either 4.5 to 1 or 3 to 1. The higher ratio, 4.5 to 1, that's generally for smaller text, which makes sense as they can usually be harder to read, so they will need stronger contrast. On the other hand, the lower ratio, 3 to 1, that's generally for larger text or graphical objects like icons, which are a little bit easier to see. Now, typically we want to make sure that everything on the page meets contrast requirements, but we do have some exceptions like decorative elements and logos. These don't need to meet contrast requirements, but when in doubt, just meet the requirements. I mean, there's never any harm in doing so, and you can't go wrong with strong contrast in your website. But that's pretty much it. That's the basics of color contrast. It's a super easy concept to grasp, and it's not hard to find a solution. So even just a little adjustment can make a really big impact on somebody. So if you're designing or you're developing or you're testing a website, make sure to check that your elements receive sufficient contrast, and that's one task off of your plate. The next common problem we're going to be talking about involves a bit more nuance to it, but it's a super important one, and it's about alternative text, or alt text for short. So alt text is basically a text substitute for an image when the image can't be displayed. And this is a really big one for screen readers because the users aren't usually able to visually see the images on the screen. So they rely on alt text to understand what the image should be. And the biggest problem that I see on most websites is that the images either don't have any alt text at all, or they do have alt text, but it's not really great alt text. And what makes alt text good versus what makes it bad, we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. But generally, good alt text should be descriptive of the image or its function. So I like to split alt text off into these three categories. The first is decorative. So if your image is decorative, as in it serves no other purpose other than making the page look pretty, then we give it blank alt text. Now be aware though that blank alt text and missing alt text are two different things. So blank alt text means that you still include the alt attribute to the image, but the value is blank or empty. So this just tells the screen reader, hey, this image is decorative, we'll skip over it because it's not important. Missing alt text, on the other hand, is when you don't add the alt attribute at all to the image. And we never want to do this because screen readers will still pick up on these images, but they won't be given an appropriate text substitute. So usually they'll read the file name, which might not be very helpful because file names can sometimes just be a random string of numbers and characters. But yeah, to summarize, decorative images provide blank alt text. Plain images, if the image is a plain image, we want to give it alt text that describes the image. And functional images, so functional images are images that is also a link or a button. We want to give these alt text that describes the function of the image rather than the actual image itself. So the first question to ask yourself is, is this a regular plain old image? Is this a decorative image, or is this a functional image? I won't go too much into further detail with decorative images because I think that's pretty straightforward. So let's move on to the other two categories and break them down. So let's start with plain images. I'm going to present you two alt texts. Both refer to the same image, but the way that they describe it is different. So the first alt text is woman looking at a pineapple. So have a think about what kind of image you see in your head when you hear this alt text. The second one is young woman shopping at a supermarket inspecting a pineapple in her hand. Again, have a think about what kind of image you see in your head with this description. And then let's take a look at the actual image these two texts are describing. Hopefully you can all agree that the second one is much closer to what you were imagining. And notice how a good descriptive alt text gives you a way better idea of what's happening in the image. Now the bad alt text, the first one, is not necessarily wrong. I mean, technically it is a woman looking at a pineapple, but because it's not descriptive enough, it can make it hard for people to understand the purpose of the image. You know, like why is this image here? What kind of information is it trying to convey? And obviously this is just one example. There's multiple other texts that you could use instead. You could go crazy with the details. You could describe what she's wearing and the background and the types of fruits that you can see. And at some point, you're probably going to ask yourself, how detailed do I need to be to write good alt text? And that's something I personally struggled with for a while, and I occasionally do still struggle with to this day, because I didn't know how much I needed to write to make sure that what I wrote was enough and not too much at the same time. And what I found is that honestly, it just depends on the context of your image. So let's just say you are writing an article on COVID and you had this image, and the main point of your article was to talk about social distancing and mask wearing. So the good alt text that we previously came up with, that probably won't be appropriate anymore, because if I was a blind screen reader user reading this article, what value do I get out of knowing that this woman is holding a pineapple? Like, it's not necessarily bad alt text. We're still describing what's happening in the photo, but we also need to think about context and what sort of details we should be including to help users understand the purpose and context of the photo. So in this situation, a slightly better alt text might be something like, young woman wearing a face mask is social distancing as she shops at a supermarket. You can see we no longer focus on the fact that she's looking at a pineapple. You can definitely still include it if you want, but we've shifted our focus more towards the fact that she's wearing a mask and she's keeping her distance. Now let's take a look at example number 2. We're going to be looking at functional images this time, and I'm going to be giving you 2 alt texts again, and you're going to have to think about what these alt texts mean to you. So for context, let's imagine that you're filling out an online form, and this alt text is describing a button. So the square with the question mark that you're about to see is where that button is. So alt text number 1, white rounded edged arrow on a black circle. Alt text number 2, continue to next page. And let's look at the actual image. You'll notice that the 2 alt texts were quite different. The first one was very descriptive of the button's image. It is indeed a white rounded edged arrow on a black circle. But the second alt text in this scenario would actually be much more appropriate than the first. And if you're asking why, this is because this is an element that can be interacted with. So buttons and links need to have slightly different alt text than plain regular images because they serve a function. So with buttons and links, we need to make sure that our alt text actually describes the function of the image rather than the actual image itself. So continue to next page is a lot more helpful in this situation than actually knowing what the arrow looks like. So there is a little bit of thinking involved to find the best alt text for your image, but really the important questions that you need to ask yourself are, does this alt text accurately describe my image or its function? If I replace this image with my alt text, would I still be able to understand the purpose of the image? And do I need to provide any context-specific details from the image? But that's the gist of alt text. I did go into a bit more detail than I needed to for an intro because I know that it can be hard sometimes to write good alt text, and it's not always the most straightforward thing. But just keep in mind that you don't need it to be perfect as long as you think about how your alt text is going to help your users, how you're going to use it to communicate the right information and help them do the things that they need to do, then that's really all there is to it. So just to summarize, if it's decorative, give it blank alt text. If it's a plain regular image, give it alt text that describes the image. And if it's a link or a button, then give it alt text that describes the function. Now let's take a look at focus indicators, which is another very common problem that is actually quite easy to fix. So a focus indicator is when you use your tab key on your keyboard to go through a page. And when you do that, the little highlighted box that you see around an element is the focus indicator. So this shows you where your focus currently is. Now this is super important for accessibility because keyboard users and the majority of assistive technologies like screen readers, they rely on a visible focus indicator. So if you can't see where your focus is, you won't know what you're going to be interacting with. It's almost like trying to navigate a website without being able to see your mouse. You need some kind of indicator to tell you where you're currently at on the page. And the problem is that websites either don't have a visible focus indicator or they do have one, but it's a bad one. And what do I mean by bad? Well, most of the time it means that it doesn't have sufficient color contrast. So let's take a look at what I mean. So we've got this button in its regular state. This is what the button looks like when it's not in focus. This one shows an example of a good focus indicator. You can see it's nice and visible, and it's easy to tell where our focus is. Now, it doesn't just have to be a border. You can change the background color or the text color too, so you're not just limited to an outline. This third one shows an example of a bad focus indicator. So it's still there. We still do have an indicator, but it has very poor contrast against our background, which means it's probably going to be hard for a lot of colorblind users to tell, what's focus and what's not in focus. And then probably the worst example is where the indicator just doesn't exist at all. And we want to avoid that at all costs because it pretty much just looks like the button is in its regular state, but really it's in focus. You just can't see it. Unfortunately, having no indicator is quite common, or at least it's not unheard of, because something that people like to do is add the CSS property outline none, which is something I actually used to be guilty of. So people usually do this for aesthetic reasons, but it's a huge problem for disabled users because when you do this, you're actually removing the default focus indicator that the browser provides. So avoid outline none on interactive elements as much as possible. Typically, you'd want to provide your own custom focus to your website to make sure that your indicators are nice and clear and they meet contrast requirements. Technically, using the browser default isn't actually a violation of WCAG because I guess in a way that responsibility falls on the browser, but it's always very, very, very strongly recommended that you provide your own focus indicator because you can't always be sure that the browser will meet contrast requirements on your website. And adding on to that, after you've provided a visible focus indicator to your elements, make sure that you check that this actually meets contrast requirements against all parts of your website. So for example, if you have the same button across different web pages and some are on a light background and others are on a dark background, you need to make sure that your focus is still visible at all times. So if you've got a black indicator, like this one, this might be visible on light backgrounds, but not on the dark ones. So the way I like to go about this is to provide a two-color indicator like this. So we've got two borders. The first one on the inside is light, and the second one on the outside is dark or black, which means that no matter what background you're on, you can be sure that at least one of the borders is visible. But that's really all there is to it. It's just all about making sure that your users can see where their focus is at all times, and once you've got that down, again, that's another task off of your plate. And then let's look at one last problem, and this is to do with forms. Now, forms by itself can honestly be a whole discussion on its own because there is so much to consider when you're dealing with them. But for now, we'll just focus on the important and immediate things that you need to know. So one of the most common problems that I see with forms is to do with form errors. So let's take a look at this, for example. We've got three fields: username, password, and email. Now let's say you filled in all of the fields like this, and you click submit, and this is what you see. All right, so we see that there's a red outline on the password field, but it's not really clear to us what the problem is or how to fix it. I mean, we've got an error message that says, please fix all errors before proceeding, but what does it actually mean? I've filled in all the fields like it's asked me to, so what's the problem? And on top of that, if you were colorblind, then the form might even look something like this. You might not even be able to pick up on the red, so you can't tell where the error is in the first place. Now, a form like this can be super frustrating, and we want to make sure that we're always communicating the right information to the user. So what can we do to make this better? Let's have a look at this. Here, we don't really change anything too much, but we have a much better example where we've now got a message that tells the user how to address the problem. Please enter a password of at least 6 characters. The user doesn't need to guess what they need to do because it's all pretty much laid out for them. And if we look at this from a colorblind user's perspective, the user can still tell that there's an error because of our message and the warning icon beside it. So even if they can't see the red, they know that there's a problem with the form and how to fix it. So the main thing to consider with forms is that you want to provide descriptive error messages. So we want to make sure that on top of the users knowing that there is a problem, we want to tell them what that error is and how exactly they can resolve it. And we want to avoid communicating information through color alone. So we always want to provide another kind of indicator other than color so that it's accessible for colorblind users as well. There's nothing wrong with using color. In fact, it's recommended to use it to communicate information. But if we want to make things accessible, we always want to make sure that it's not the only way that we're communicating that information. So that's the gist of form errors. Nothing too complicated. It's just about making sure that the process is clear and fair for all of your users. Now, another super common problem that I see with forms, which is potentially even more common than form errors actually, is to do with labeling. So whenever you have a form and you have input fields on that form, they always need a label. And I've come across many forms that don't, which is not ideal. So first off, when I talk about labels, I'm talking about the text that you see above or beside an input field, and it describes what should go in the field. And the problem I see is when the input field either doesn't have a label at all to begin with, or when it looks like it does have a label, but it actually doesn't. Now that sounds a bit confusing, and this part involves a bit of code, but nothing too complex. So let's have a look at what I mean. So here we've got an input field, and it looks like we have a label that says username. Okay, that looks accessible. But if we inspect the code, which you can do yourself when you're browsing the web, you just right-click on any label on a form and click inspect, you can see that the label actually uses a span. Now, for users who can see the form, this doesn't really seem like a big deal because it looks like we have a label, and so we assume that it is a label. But for screen reader users, as I mentioned before, they rely heavily on the HTML markup because the HTML elements carry semantic meaning. So for them, this is just a span, which is pretty much just regular text. This isn't connected in any way or form to the input field, so all screen readers users will know is that it's an input field, but the user won't actually know what to put in the field. So the way to fix this, and it's super simple, is to use the label element for labels. And to make sure that this label is linked to the input field, we can either nest the input field inside the label, like we have on the left, or we can add a for attribute to the label, which just matches the input's ID. And this will create a relationship between the label and the input field so that screen reader users will know what information to put in each field. And that's it. That's all you need to do to make sure that each form field is labeled correctly. It's such an easy fix that has a huge impact on accessibility. So if you're a developer, this is a really quick and easy one to keep in mind. So that's all we're going to cover today for common accessibility problems. We've only got time to cover just the basics, but hopefully that's given you a better idea of the kind of things to expect and look out for. Obviously, there's a whole lot more to it than that, and there's a bunch of guidelines and standards that we need to follow, but I think it's good to keep in mind the point that I mentioned earlier, which is that you could try to memorize all of the rules and solutions to all of these problems, but what's probably going to help you more in the early stages especially is understanding the types of things that people might struggle with. So if you know that someone might have trouble seeing colors, then you know straight away to use strong contrast and not to use color by itself. Or if you know that someone might have trouble hearing your videos, then you know to provide captions or a text transcript. And all of these things will come more naturally the more you incorporate accessibility in your product. And now let's take a look at how web accessibility is actually measured. And this is using the international standard called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short. So think of WCAG as a list of criteria for making sure your content is accessible. I believe we have about 80 success criteria in total, but the number of criteria that you'll need to meet will depend on two things. So the first is the WCAG version, and the second is the compliance level that you're targeting. So as of this recording, the latest version that we have is WCAG 2.2. So this was only released in October last year, so it's still very new and mostly includes some additions to the previous version's requirements. So basically how it works is when a new version comes out, it builds on top of the previous version. So it might add or remove some criteria, but typically all the versions are backward compatible. So that means if your website is compliant with 2.2, you're also going to be compliant with 2.1. If your website is compliant with 2.1 and you want to upgrade to 2.2, then you'll probably only need to check the handful of new requirements and not have to go through the entire 2.2 list. Although you're very welcome to, of course. And then with WCAG levels, WCAG has 3, A, AA, and AAA. So the higher you go up in level, the stricter and more requirements that you typically have to meet. And these levels are not exclusive. So in order to meet a AA level, you need to first meet all of the level A requirements and then the AA requirements on top of that. Similarly, if you want to meet a AAA level, you'll need to meet both level A and AA requirements first, and then also meet all of the AAA ones. You can't just meet all of the AAA and leave out A and AA, because firstly, that won't technically get you to a AAA standard, and second, that won't really do much for you because Level A covers a lot of the basic things that you need at a minimum level, whereas AAA goes into the more nitty-gritty of things. So they usually expand on what you've already done at an A level. And like I mentioned before, there are government laws, depending on where you are, that require websites to meet a certain level. In New Zealand and in most other places, I believe, that requirement is only for 2.1 AA. I have very rarely seen a website that actually meets AAA, because even though it is the most accessible, for most websites, AAA requirements can be very strict. So you're quite limited as to what you can do on your site. So in most cases, AA is sufficient. It covers quite a lot already and provides pretty decent accessibility. So that is the most popular standard of WCAG and what you would probably want to aim for. And we've now hopefully got a pretty decent understanding of what accessibility is, and that's great. But the big question is, what can you actually do now? We know what we need to do, we know what we need to look out for, but how do we actually get started? And the first thing I think you need to do is to create a plan. So ask yourself these questions. What are the government laws in your area, and do they apply to you? What level and version of WCAG do you want to target? What part of your product do you need to review? I personally recommend starting off with the most popular or most visited pages of your website, because those will benefit the most from accessibility. Who needs to be involved with the process? So pretty much think about what kind of budget and resources do you need? Do you need to provide any additional staff training, or do you need to seek any external support? And finally, what are your timelines? So when can you start, and when do you want to achieve these goals by? These are just a few questions to get you started, but I think it's super important that you do ask yourself these things before you do any work, because often just saying that you want to make something accessible isn't enough. You still need to know exactly what that means and have concrete, measurable milestones that you can accomplish. And everyone has a part to play. Everyone can contribute to accessibility regardless of your role. So I've just got some examples here of different responsibilities that different people might have. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, or meant to be the only responsibilities that you have, but more so just some ideas on how you can help. So if you are a product manager or a product owner, you have the overall responsibility of managing how these accessibility requirements will be met. So you'll probably play a big part in creating that plan and figuring out what and who is needed to execute it. If you are a user researcher or involved with user interaction, part of your job will be to understand what these people need and what their preferences are, and include this in your work. If you are a designer, you'll need to incorporate good accessibility practices in your designs. So you'll need to have a basic understanding of accessibility requirements, like color contrast and focus states. If you are a developer, you'll need to make sure that you are writing semantic HTML and you're using the appropriate markup. So you'll be responsible for implementing the more technical aspects of accessibility. And if you're a content author, your job will be to make sure you're writing accessible content. So using simple language, using meaningful links, and using proper heading structure. Now this list could go on and on, but the point here is that just because you're not a developer or you don't have the technical skills to make the changes doesn't mean you can't be part of making something accessible. And I put together some links on this slide to help you get started with accessibility. So the first one provides some easy accessibility tips for designing, writing, and developing. So that's a great one to look at for any easy wins, and honestly, anything on that website is super useful for getting started. The second one is the link to the official WCAG 2.2 document. So this covers some background on WCAG, the requirements for each criterion, and some additional links that cover each one in detail. So this is great if you want to take a look at the standard in a little bit more depth. And the last one is WebAIM, which is just a website with some super useful resources, like the contrast checker that I use. They've also got some articles on how to write good HTML and write accessible content. So lots of great things in there, and definitely still things that I look at from time to time, so go check that out. But yeah, that's about it for today's webinar. We have covered quite a lot today. So hopefully you now have a better understanding of what web accessibility is. I know it can be quite a big topic for sure. At least it definitely seemed like that for me when I first started learning. But again, if you can break things down and focus on how you can make other people's lives easier, then you'll soon find that, accessibility isn't really as complicated as it might seem. But yeah, if you have any questions, or maybe you just want to learn more about how accessibility can benefit you or your organization, feel free to reach out to us at Catalyst. We're always striving to make accessibility a priority in our work, so don't hesitate to reach out if you're interested in learning what services we offer. And yeah, we'll wrap up here for now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been helpful and educational, and that you've learned something new. Thank you.